What if the fate of an entire continent once hung on the will of a 23-year-old girl the world thought would break? Austria was dying. Enemies closed in like wolves. Her allies vanished. Her crown was mocked. Her empire rotting from the inside. But she didn't flinch. She sharpened her mind, armored her soul, and faced kings with cold fire in her eyes. She outmaneuvered backstabbing diplomats, stared down the butcher of Silesia, and rewrote power with blood and steel. Behind her silks and prayer books, strategy, ruthlessness, a ticking bomb in a corset. This isn't just history, it's the story they tried to bury. And you're already too close to turn back. Vienna, October 20th, 1740. The bells toll, but no one hears them. Not really. Their clangs echo down the cold marble halls of the Habsburg Palace like war drums wrapped in mourning veils. The emperor is dead. Charles VI's lifeless body lies stiff and still beneath velvet sheets. But the empire he ruled for nearly 3 decades is already convulsing. Not with grief. No, grief requires time. What shakes the palace now is fear. Raw, choking, unspoken fear. The kind that sits behind the eyes and tightens the lungs. Servants move like ghosts. Courtiers stare at each other too long. No one says it aloud, but they all know. It wasn't supposed to be her. Maria Theresa stands alone in the imperial chapel, lips pale, fists clenched so tight, her knuckles bloom white. 23 years old, draped in black, her mind spirals through 1,000 voices, none of them her own. Her father's advisors told her she was too young, too emotional, too soft for the brutal weight of power. Her tutors taught her music and manners, not the anatomy of empire. They never expected her to rule. They never thought she'd have to. But now there's no one left. No brothers. No male heirs. Just her. And an empire that's already being torn apart by jackals who've waited years for this exact moment. The pragmatic sanction. The document her father moved heaven and earth to enforce. The decree that was supposed to silence all doubt about her right to rule. Shatters in seconds. Like paper and fire. Charles begged kings, bribed nobles, threatened allies to recognize his daughter as heir. He sold his pride for signatures. But the ink wasn't dry before Prussia sharpened its knives. News races down the Danube faster than wind. Frederick II of Prussia, young, brilliant, and hungry, sends troops into Silesia within weeks. No warning, no negotiation, just steel boots on frozen ground and blood in the snow. It is not war. It is robbery. Austria's richest province, the jewel of its crown, ripped away while the new empress is still laying her father to rest. And the others? France, Bavaria, Saxony, Spain? They circle like vultures, claws tucked behind silk smiles, each claiming some twisted legal right to the Habsburg inheritance. They speak of laws, of treaties, of balance, but their eyes burn with greed. They see Maria Theresa not as a sovereign, but as a girl playing dress-up in a dead man's shadow. But this girl doesn't flinch. She doesn't weep before her court. She doesn't beg. She doesn't flee. She fights. There's no coronation feast. No golden welcome. Instead, there's a table cluttered with warm maps, letters of betrayal, and the deafening silence of allies who suddenly forget their promises. Maria Theresa tears through them, one name at a time. Who stands with me? Who sells me out? The answers carve lines into her face faster than age. She speaks to the Hungarian Diet in 1741, one of the oldest and most dangerous assemblies of nobles in Europe. She rides in with her infant son in her arms, dressed not in gowns, but in armor. Her voice shakes, but her words strike like thunder. "I have no one left but you," she says, eyes locked with theirs. "My enemies would tear this land to pieces. If you abandon me now, it is over." For a heartbeat, the chamber is still. Then swords rise. Shouts echo. They choose her, not because she is a woman, but because she refuses to be anyone else. But that moment of loyalty is a flicker in a storm. The empire she inherits isn't a single body. It's a hydra, writhing heads of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, each with its own heartbeat and agenda. The Holy Roman Empire is only holy in name, and Maria Theresa must drag it, claw it, into survival. Every day is a chess match played on broken glass. Every night, she sleeps with enemies just across the border, and sometimes at her own dinner table. She writes letters not as ruler, but as general, diplomat, and widow-to-be, warning her husband Francis, "Do not trust them, not for a second." But Francis is no emperor. She holds the weight alone. Even her advisors doubt her, whispers crawling along corridors, too proud, too young, too stubborn. But she keeps her enemies close. She memorizes every insult, every slight. Not out of weakness, out of calculation. She bleeds in private, but in public, she burns. And still, the empire teeters. Famine creeps in. Treasuries empty. Corpses pile along Silesian roads. France backs her enemies, while Britain hesitates. Her own cousins conspire against her. And yet, Maria Theresa doesn't stop. She cannot. There is no one left to catch the empire if it falls. No second chance. No retreat. In private chambers, her children cry and tug at her skirts. In council rooms, old men scoff and roll their eyes. In enemy camps, generals mock her with laughter. But still she moves, one order, one reform, one defiant breath at a time. She is not a revolutionary. Not yet. She is survival incarnate. And she knows, if she falters once, if she hesitates even for a moment, everything her ancestors built, centuries of blood, alliance, and power, will be dust. And her name will be forgotten. But Maria Theresa was not born to be remembered. She was born to endure. And as winter sinks its claws into Europe and Prussian steel continues to cut through her empire, the girl they doubted becomes the force they fear. Not by birthright, not by law, but by fire. And it's only just begun. The snow was falling sideways the morning Maria Theresa put on armor. Not for show, not for ceremony, for war. Steel gleamed across her chest. A sword hung at her hip. The wind bit through the royal robes hidden underneath. She didn't flinch. In the Hungarian Assembly Hall, frozen, hostile, waiting, she stood with her infant son in her arms and stared down centuries of tradition, arrogance, and disbelief. The crown she wore was real, but fragile. The empire behind it was bleeding. She raised her voice, not soft, not graceful, but cutting like broken glass. "Abandoned by all, I place my trust in you." Her words echoed off stone walls and hearts like gunfire. She wasn't begging. She was daring them to doubt her again. The nobles blinked. Some shifted. One knelt. Then another. Swords unsheathed with the hiss of thunderclouds splitting open. Vitam et sanguinem pro Maria Theresa. Their lives. Their blood. For her. But outside that hall, Europe was already ripping itself apart. It started with Silesia. Frederick of Prussia, young, cunning, merciless, had struck fast and hard. No declaration. No warning. Just black boots crushing snow and cannon fire cracking open silence. Silesia wasn't just land, it was gold. Mines, factories, people. The lung of Austria's economy. Frederick didn't ask. He took. Maria Theresa sent troops. Too late. Too untrained. They died in frozen fields, lungs filling with blood and frost. She cursed Frederick's charm, his flattery, his letters that once read like friendship. He had called her my dear cousin. Now, he moved like a predator who'd tasted blood and wanted more. Other powers watched and smiled. France aligned with Bavaria. Spain bared its teeth. The Habsburg crown wasn't just contested, it was hunted. Austria became a carcass in the woods, and every king in Europe came with a knife. Her allies? Britain wavered. The Dutch hesitated. Vienna was surrounded by wolves, and inside the palace, the walls were whispering again, "She's lost." Too young, too proud, too alone. But Maria Theresa didn't shatter. She transformed. Every tear she had once shed turned to ink on decrees. Every insult she'd swallowed came back as fire in her letters. She weaponized everything. Her motherhood, her piety, her beauty, her fury. She wasn't just a ruler. She became a symbol. Propaganda swept the empire like wildfire. Artists painted her with halos. Poets called her God's chosen. Mothers named their daughters after her. She turned weakness into myth, and myth into loyalty. But war doesn't care for legends. The Bavarians marched on Vienna. France pushed through Bohemia. Entire provinces flipped like coins. Her own cousin Charles Albert declared himself emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Her family, her blood, betraying her in broad daylight. She gritted her teeth and prepared for counterattack. In 1742, her generals struck back. Austrians stormed into Bavaria, sacked Munich, and burn the pretenders thrown to ash. The people cheered. But victories came at a price. Screams in the snow, limbs lost to musket balls, cities turned to smoke. Every battlefield became a message: she will not be erased. Then came Dettingen. 1743, British troops, for once, stood shoulder to shoulder with Austrians. Frederick watched from the north, calculating. Always calculating. The Austro-British force crushed the French advance. Blood soaked the fields. Men drowned in river crossings. But the message was clear. Maria Theresa was not backing down. Still, the war dragged on. 7 years of shifting alliances. 7 years of whispers and backstabs and maps that bled red and black ink. She gave birth between battles. She buried children while giving commands. Her skin paled. Her eyes darkened. Her letters to her husband grew colder, more clipped. She no longer asked for comfort. She asked for silence, for strength, for loyalty. Even her enemies began to speak of her with something close to fear. Not admiration. Not yet. But fear. Because she refused to fall. Because she kept rising. And because in every loss, she sowed a seed for the next move. Frederick of Prussia once said she had the soul of a man. He was wrong. She had something older, something harder. The soul of a storm that never stops coming. And then, 1748. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Not a triumph. Not a defeat. A pause. Austria kept the throne, but lost Silesia. The jewel she fought for, cried for, bled for. Gone. Maria Theresa swallowed the poison, signed the paper, and looked every ambassador in the eye like she already knew their grandsons would kneel before her sons. The ink dried. The cannons cooled. But her fire didn't. There was no peace in her silence. Because while Europe called it a treaty, she called it a warning. The windows of the Hofburg dripped with fog the morning she ordered the empire to be reborn. Not patched. Not healed. Rebuilt. Brick by brick, bone by bone. Maria Theresa stood alone in her study, 1749. The war had ended, but there was no silence. Only the haunting echoes of what had been lost. Silesia was gone. Thousands dead. The map of her father's empire now bore the scars of treaties written in desperation. Her enemies had stopped fighting, but they hadn't stopped watching. She could feel their breath on her neck. Austria wasn't safe. It was sick, and she would cut it open before it rotted to the core. No fanfare. No applause. She signed her orders with hands that had trembled too long and now refused to shake. Tax reforms. Military drafts. Censuses. Regulations. She didn't ask permission. She sent commands. The empire had bled enough. The old order, noble estates fat on land they barely touched, clergy who preached obedience but hoarded gold, officials who bought their titles with bribes, was a disease. She didn't debate it. She hunted it. In Vienna, officials awoke to find their offices ransacked by new auditors. Corrupt judges were fired without warning. Entire departments dissolved overnight. Feudal lords who thought themselves untouchable received cold letters marked with her seal. Your privileges are hereby revoked. Some protested. Others begged. None were spared. She raised taxes on the rich. Forced the church to pay. Nobles screamed betrayal, slammed fists on oak tables, and called her a tyrant in private. But she didn't flinch. She stared them down with eyes that had seen cities burn and children buried in royal cradles. Their wealth would no longer buy their silence. Their names no longer bought them power. She wasn't their queen. She was their reckoning. In 1750, she turned to the schools. Not to polish nobles. Not to entertain. To arm the poor with knowledge. Because an uneducated empire was an empire waiting to collapse. She made education mandatory. Built schools where there were none. Sent inspectors to ensure boys and girls were learning. Priests resisted. Bishops warned her she was offending tradition, corrupting the soul. She ignored them. She believed in God. But she believed in reason more. And reason had no time for superstition, no mercy for ignorance. Her own palace became a laboratory of control. Maps filled her walls, not of rivers or borders, but of farmland, population density, grain yields. She wanted to know everything. How many horses a village had. How many boys could hold a musket. How many widows lived without bread? She ordered the first true census, not for charity, but for precision. No emperor before her had tried. They ruled. She managed. Every law was tracked. Every coin counted. She turned government into machinery. Cold, efficient, relentless. Her advisors feared her. They didn't gossip when she entered the room. They stopped breathing. Even her own ministers whispered she was becoming something other. Not just a monarch, a system. But the machine didn't run on obedience alone. It ran on her fury, and her fury had no end. Behind closed doors, she read reports on starvation, theft, soldiers going unpaid, villages crumbling under old debts. She didn't cry. She summoned their governors and made them read those same reports aloud, to her face. Some wept. She didn't blink. She replaced them before their tears dried. She gave Austria its first standing army. Not mercenaries, not borrowed troops, citizen soldiers. She restructured the officer corps, demanded discipline, standard pay, loyalty not to the general, but to the crown. Promotions were no longer bought. They were earned. Titles no longer guaranteed command. The old nobility called her cruel. She called them obsolete. By 1753, Austria's administrative backbone had changed. Beneath her, a loyal corps of bureaucrats, men who owed everything to her and nothing to bloodlines, ran her state with brutal efficiency. They carried out her laws like a holy code. They knew she was watching, always watching. But not every reform came with thunder. Some arrived like a whisper in the dark. She banned torture in trials, not out of softness, but clarity. Let guilt prove itself, she wrote, not bruises. She introduced new criminal codes, simplified procedures, allowed appeals. Justice became uniform, predictable, not perfect, but clean. The Enlightenment had reached her gates, candle in hand. She didn't throw it open. She cracked the door. Enough to let in light, never enough to let it burn the house down. She welcomed reason, but she feared revolution. Ideas were useful. Unrest was fatal. In every policy, she walked a blade. Between tradition and transformation. Between what was possible and what would not forgive her if she moved too fast. Because change is never free. It costs peace. It costs friends. It costs pieces of your soul you didn't know could bleed. And Maria Theresa bled alone. Her nights were filled with ink and exhaustion. Letters to her children. Reports from the countryside. Pleas for more reforms. Threats from those who hated them. Sometimes she sat in her chamber long after the candles had burned out, listening to the silence claw at the walls. She had built an empire from ashes. But empires don't thank you. They consume you. And still, she wrote the next decree. And the next. And the next. Because she knew what her enemies had not yet learned. The war for Austria had never ended. It had simply gone quiet. The crib was silent. Not the silence of sleep, but of stillness. Heavy, hollow, eternal. Maria Theresa stood at the edge of the nursery, breath held hostage in her chest. Another child gone. Another name she would never whisper again. Her 17th pregnancy had ended, and the palace echoed with polite condolences spoken through clenched jaws and closed doors. But the crown never mourned long. Not in public. Not when the world demanded heirs like soldiers and used children like currency. She turned away from the cradle. Her tears didn't fall. They folded inward, into steel, into strategy, into cold resolve. If war built empires, blood would keep hers breathing. Francis Stephen had been her choice, yes. But even love, in her world, came with price tags and contracts. A duke without a kingdom, traded like livestock for political approval. To marry her, he gave up his ancestral Lorraine, torn from his bloodline and handed to France like a dowry made of dirt. He did it for her. She never forgot that. But love didn't stop the loneliness. She wore the crown. He wore the title. But the weight? That was hers alone. He ruled beside her, but never with her. He wandered. He gambled. He filled his hours with distractions while she filled hers with the survival of a dynasty. Their letters held affection, but never rest. Not when kingdoms watched for cracks in their union. Not when betrayal could be sealed with a wedding ring or a cradle. So she built her empire with womb and will. 17 children. Names, titles, futures forged before they could speak. Each one a tool, a lifeline, a weapon. Maria Carolina to Naples, Leopold to Tuscany, Ferdinand to Medina, Joseph to the Holy Roman Empire, and then Marie Antoinette, her youngest surviving daughter, her favorite, her gamble. France had been Austria's enemy for over a century. But in 1756, the world shifted like a fault line snapping beneath empires. Old allies turned enemies. Old enemies reached out with bloodied hands. The diplomatic revolution, they called it. Maria Theresa called it what it was: war without swords. She sent her daughter to Versailles, not for peace, for permanence, to anchor Austria in the heart of its oldest threat. Antoinette was 14, a child wrapped in silk, kissed by strangers, stripped of her name at the French border. "You are no longer Austrian," they told her. "You belong to France now." Maria Theresa watched the carriage vanish. She said nothing. She went back to her papers. Her stomach twisted. Her pen did not stop. Every alliance cost something, and this one would cost more than she knew. 1756 became a knife year. Frederick of Prussia struck again. He moved like a shadow, fast and cruel. The 7 Years' War began, not with honor, but with fire. He invaded Saxony before Austria could even load a musket. Maria Theresa rallied armies again. Not green boys now, but trained soldiers. Not scattered nobles, but a state machine she had built from ash. She believed, this time will be different. It wasn't. The war stretched across continents, from Prague to Bengal to Quebec. But for her, it was still personal. Still Silesia. Still Frederick. He danced circles around her generals. He bled her dry. And still, she refused to give him an inch of her soul. Austria burned, but she stood, wounded, raging, unbroken. Francis died in 1765. She didn't cry at the funeral. She couldn't. Not with Joseph beside her, staring at the coffin like it belonged to someone he barely knew. He was emperor now, but she didn't let go. She couldn't. Not yet. They ruled together, tension humming like a blade between them. He was cold, rational, impatient. She was relentless, emotional, bound to tradition and haunted by ghosts. He wanted progress. She wanted stability. He questioned her judgment. She questioned his heart. Their letters snapped with fire. And still, she moved the pieces on the board. Marriages turned into treaties. Children became pawns and queens. Her lineage stretched like webbing across Europe. Every birth another thread. Every union another knot. But not all knots held. Whispers began to drift in from Paris. Antoinette, frivolous, spoiled, hated. The Austrian woman, they hissed. Foreign, unfit. They mocked her laughter, her clothes, her womb, her silence. And Maria Theresa, hundreds of miles away, read every letter, every insult, every cold truth wrapped in parchment. She wrote to her daughter in ink that trembled with fury and fear. Be better, be wiser, be worthy. Because if Antoinette failed, Austria would bleed again. But there were limits even Maria Theresa couldn't bend. Her empire survived, but parts of it slipped through her fingers like sand. Silesia, still gone. The Holy Roman Empire, fragmented, fraying, ancient, and stubborn. She had made allies out of enemies, but never made them family. Trust had become a myth. Power was the only language they spoke. She had built something, vast, living, radiant in places, but it wasn't invincible. And in the quiet hours, when the war drums had gone silent and the children had scattered to their thrones, she would sit beneath portraits of their wedding days, reading letters, correcting state reports, and wonder, had she saved the empire? Or only kept it from collapsing on her watch? She never answered. She never stopped. Because the empire had her name stitched into its skin, and she was not finished yet. The bells rang for Francis, but they mourned for her. August 18, 1765, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire collapsed without warning, breath snatched mid-sentence. His heart betrayed him in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. He fell to the ground, eyes wide, mouth frozen halfway through a word no one would ever remember. When they told Maria Theresa, she didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She stood, straight-backed, silent, stone. But something inside her cracked, and it never healed. For hours she locked herself in her chapel, hands clasped so tightly they turned raw. She prayed, not for comfort, but for punishment. Her letters turned black with grief, ink thick, lines pressed too hard. "The world is dead to me," she wrote. "I wear black until the grave swallows me too." She meant it. She buried her husband. Then she buried the part of herself that once smiled. The empress who had once worn armor now wore mourning lace, always. Her throne no longer offered power, only distance. Her eyes turned harder. Her face aged faster. The weight of the crown no longer rested on her shoulders. It became her skeleton. Joseph, now emperor in name, stood beside her. a co-ruler by title, a son by blood, but between them stretched a battlefield. He wanted reform, fast, fierce, unforgiving. He wanted to rip out superstition, crush the old, install reason like scaffolding. She called it madness. He called her blind. He had no memory of war, of siege, of the smell of gunpowder curling through the windows of a burning city. He didn't know what it took to hold an empire together with nothing but fear and letters and prayers scratched in candlelight. She watched him with a mother's pride and a sovereign's suspicion. She saw a future she couldn't control, a future that might undo everything she had held together with blood and will. He abolished serfdom behind her back. She reversed it. He opened the doors to Protestants. She slammed them shut. He rolled his eyes at confession. She clutched her rosary until her knuckles blistered. At court, their arguments hissed behind velvet doors. Servants paused outside, pretending not to hear the storm. And yet, she couldn't let go. Because letting go meant surrendering not just power, but memory. Letting go meant admitting that the empire she rebuilt might only survive by becoming something she no longer recognized. Her body began to fail before her mind. Coughs that wouldn't stop. Lungs that wouldn't fill. She walked slower. Wrote shorter letters. Needed more candles to see. But she refused to be useless. Refused to vanish. She governed from her bed if she had to. Dictated with breath that rattled in her chest. Corrected ministers through fits of coughing. Ordered reports brought to her chamber before the blood on her handkerchief dried. She feared God. She feared death. But what she feared most was irrelevance. As Joseph grew bolder, she grew more devout. Her bedroom became a shrine. Crucifixes, relics, images of saints. She confessed every week. Flagellated herself in secret. Lit candles for sins no one had seen. She believed suffering was holy, that her pain might buy the empire one more year of peace. But peace never stayed long. Whispers from France began again. Whispers of famine, rage, revolution. Antoinette was no longer a daughter. She was a target. Maria Theresa read the letters from Versailles, fists clenched. Her baby, the bright one, the spoiled one, the fragile one, was dancing on the edge of a knife. She wrote warnings, pleaded, begged her to act with care. Be a queen, she wrote, not a child. But it was too late. France no longer feared Austria. It laughed at her. She looked across her empire and saw cracks in every wall. Old enemies, still watching. Old allies, now disinterested. The people, weary. The nobles, restless. The reforms, unfinished. And Joseph, pushing harder, faster, without looking back. In the summer of 1780, her breath shortened. The air itself became heavy. She moved less, spoke less. Her hands trembled when they touched paper. But she still ruled, even with her bones aching, even with her mind clouded by fever. She would not die weak. Not in front of them. Not in front of her son. On November 29th, the candles burned low. She asked for silence. For prayer. No doctors. No noise. Just the soft whisper of Latin rites and the taste of death rising in her throat. The Habsburg matriarch, the woman who had faced down kings, rewritten laws, married Europe into her grasp, closed her eyes. One last breath. Then silence. Not the silence of grief. The silence of something enormous ending. And the halls of the palace felt colder. Not because the fire had gone out, but because the hand that fed it had finally let go.